Sudan's a bit different from some of the other cases in like some of the other countries where they have civil wars. But at least in the Sudanese like civil war, the average civilian doesn't support either side. You have like these two sides. You have the government and then this private militia, and then most Sudanese don't prefer like either of them.
Right.
There might be a slight preference depending on if you had any trauma with the previous ones. Like if your village was raided by the army, then you might have a slight preference for the private militia. But if your village was like raided by the private militia, you have a preference for the army. Or some people are like, I don't want to be ruled by some private militia. Like I'd prefer some organized organization. So they slightly prefer the army. But for like the majority of the situation, you have no skin in the game. You don't care about who wins. Like the ideal scenario is that they both lose, but
Right.
that's not going to happen. So that's what makes it kind of concerning and also kind of disheartening for most people.
I guess that's what I also wanted to know is that are either of the sides fighting? Is there a right or wrong side? But it clearly seems like they're
Yeah,
just both in the wrong.
they're both in the wrong. Like people don't want either. People want a democratic like government.
Didn't they attempt a democratic government in, was it
2019.
2019 after al-Bashir got dethroned from his dictatorship?
Yeah.
And then what happened after that? That
So
escalated into all this.
so what happened was so al-Bashir was overthrown, and in order to overthrow a dictator, it has to be done by the army, right? So in essence, the army was in control at that point in Sudan. So the army was like, okay, we overthrew your president, so we'll like secede to whatever you guys want. And so people, they always said they want Madaniya, 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 which means like we want like a civil rule, civil rule, civil rule, right? So they want a civilian who's leading the government. And so the army was like, okay, we're not going to give you full civilian rule. What we're going to give you is like a transitional government. So it's going to be like half civilians and then half army representatives. And then they're like, okay, after like a couple of years, I think it was 2 years, we'll move to a fully civilian government. So people are like, okay, that's fair. We'll need 2 years to like start campaigns for people to, get the political party up. The country's in pretty bad shape. Our political system isn't great. So makes sense, right? And so then they appointed somebody for the civilian side who was pretty popular. His name was Hamadouk. He worked at like the World Bank. He had like a high position there, and so people wanted him. He was a popular person, and then he came in. He appointed a lot of like very like I guess well-respected people from the country, and it was essentially what people wanted. It was like the government that people wanted to see, right? But the issue was that the civilians weren't actually given any power. They came up with all these ideas, all these plans, and they were like, okay, let's implement it. And the army's like, nah, we don't want to do that. And then they're like, okay, technically, we have the votes, we're like a slight majority to you guys, so we should be able to do this. And the army's like, nah, we're not going to let you. So eventually, it got so bad to the extent that basically the leader Hamadouk was like, you know what, guys, I'm not going to waste your time. I'm going to resign because this isn't working. And so that was essentially the collapse of the civilian government. And so then the army just fully took over. They've always had the power, but now it's just been covert. People started protesting, and then you have this paramilitary group that comes in, and they come into Khartoum, and that's when the fighting starts. And then this leader of the paramilitary group, his name is Hemeti. He's like vying for power with the government, led by Burhan. So and then it just kind of like devolved into a civil war.
Well, because in 2019, when al-Bashir got overthrown, it was Hemeti and Burhan who came together and did the overthrowing, right?
And isn't that funny? Yeah.
Yeah, and wasn't it Hemeti who was kind of al-Bashir's right-hand man as part of the leader of the paramilitary group?
So it's interesting. This playbook, you see it constantly throughout history. It's basically like Taliban and the U.S. relationship. It's like, some people say it's like Hamas and Israel relationship. Like you have a group that's funded by the government, and eventually they just like turn on the government, right? That's funding them. So this group that Hemeti was leading, they're called the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces. So I was talking about like the ethnic conflicts that were happening before, right? So in Darfur, for instance, there was like a lot of ethnic conflicts that were happening between the government and the local people there. So the government was constantly like attacking and bombing that area. But the government army like involved like a lot of like heavy artillery, like tanks, like planes and stuff. And so there were like other ethnic groups who were against the same people the government was against. So they were like essentially like ethnically Arab people in that area that wanted to attack some of the people who were who were rebelling against the government. So the government enlisted them, and that became the Rapid Support Forces. And the reason they're called the Rapid Support Forces is because they used to have these like pickup trucks with guns on them, and they would just like come in, completely destroy, loot like a village, and then leave really quickly because they had these like fast vehicles.
And the Rapid Support Forces were previously the Janjaweed, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They went through an official brand,
exactly.
rebrand.
They're like, all right, like, we're going international. We got to change names like RSF so that other people can recognize our name. Yeah.
We got a bad rep, so we gotta switch things up.
Exactly.
Find a new PR team. And make that well known. Where does the U.S. come in all this? Because I know that there, as you said, it seems with every paramilitary or radical anti-government rebel force, there seems to be all roads trace back to the U.S. somehow, some way.
Yeah.
So would you know how the U.S. is involved or why the U.S. would be involved in this?
So obviously there's like the resource side of things, right? Like Sudan has a lot of resources like gold, oil. So there's always like vying for resources, and not just the US, you have China and Russia. But one thing I just want to make clear, and then, some people ask about like why Sudan isn't getting a lot of attention, right? And it's because people think that it's a civil war and that like the Sudanese people have to work it out, right? But rarely are civil wars actually just within people. It eventually becomes a battleground for a lot of people. So like technically right now in Sudan, the government is backed by Russia. And then you have the private militia is backed by Russia, and then the government's backed by Ukraine. So there were like Ukraine operations that were happening in Sudan. And same thing, like certain Gulf countries, I think the UAE's like with the Rapid Support Group, and then I think Saudis with the government. And so it just becomes like I forget the word, but just like a Cold War between a lot of countries, and the war is happening in Sudan. It's essentially a war of influence. So technically it is a civil war, but in reality it's nothing but a civil, it's nothing but a civil war, right?
Right, because we think of civil war that, the whole country is just fighting each other.
Yeah.
But in reality, it's just the military group of the government and a paramilitary group that's outside of the main military group trying to decide who's gonna lead the country, essentially, or lead the military.
And those military groups are controlled by other foreign interests, and that's kind of where the issue is, right? Is that for instance, the UAE wants to make sure that they get access to like gold, or like Russia wants to make sure that they get access to like oil. So, all these foreign interests are influencing groups. Because for instance, the government military, it makes sense where they get their funding, right? They tax people, they have like state-owned companies. But when you look at a private militia that was fully supported by the government, and then all of a sudden turns 180 on the government, right? Where are you getting your money from, right? Yeah, so they have to be backed by somebody. And there's been, we've seen like Russian aircraft, coming into Sudan. A lot of them have like Russian like military weapons. So yeah, you could see that it's like becoming like a war of influence in the area.